There we are. We're back. So hopefully you've had a nice lunch. And now we are on to our afternoon session where we're going to be looking at two topics, a brief stop around Web3 music services, and then we're going to be looking at music and the Metaverse. And for this panel, firstly, I just want to thank all of you because everyone has flown in from here, there, and everywhere. Particularly Con, who I was thinking like, shit, he's going to have to do this in the middle of the night in Australia. But instead of that, he's flown all the way around the world to be here. So, you know, thanks very much. Well done. There you go. Special round of applause. And also I'll let Dan introduce the panel, but a special thank you as well to Dan Fowler, who's been so helpful in putting the event together and coming up with suggestions with speakers and everything. He's given an awful lot of time. So yeah, anyway, I'll hand over to you, Dan, to introduce the panel. Cheers.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. And it's a pleasure to help. Big fan of Music Ally, obviously. I think rather than me introduce the panel, I think it's probably better if you guys give a brief introduction to yourselves, and then I'll talk about myself and we'll dive in. So Roneil, if you want to kick off.
Yeah. All right. Hey, everyone. Roneil, I'm one of the co-founders of a project called Audius. It's a music community and discovery platform that connects artists and fans directly to one another. And it achieves that by being fully.
Roneil, 1 second.
It wasn't
A little bit of a false start here.
I was like, am I? Sure, yeah. So yeah, all right, I can start over again. So I'm Roneil. I'm one of the co-founders of a project called Audius. It's a music community and discovery platform that connects artists and fans directly with one another. And that direct piece is really where we see our key differentiator being, serving about 7 million fans today on a monthly basis and around 250,000 artists. So it's been a fun 3-4 years or so since we got started.
1, 2, yeah, working. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophie Goossens. I am a lawyer. I'm a partner at the law firm ReedSmith, which is just around the corner. My focus is on anything to do with copyright and tech. And I also have a background as a music lawyer. So I think I'm in the right place at the right panel.
Thanks. Con Raso. I'm founder and CEO of Tune Global. Tune Global's a technology enabler. So clients usually come to us that are trying to do something interesting in music, like creating Web2 streaming services, doing different things in that space, more and more Web3 leads coming in. So we have 85 million tracks in our catalog. We look after that for the various rights holders, from majors to indies to micro artists and labels in unusual territories sometimes. And so we really approach it from what our clients are looking for, and then can our technology help them deliver those outcomes.
Cool. I'm Dan. I lead open source projects at HIFI Labs. You saw Jack Spallone, who's also at HIFI Labs, on the last panel. My focus is on trying to build open source infrastructure that's going to sort of help use this new industry and help people build experiences on top of it. That's probably the best way to describe it. Cool, let's dive in. So the topic of this panel is Web3 music services. Obvious first question, what is a Web3 music service and what's your most favorite example of one? Probably best start with you, Roneil.
Yeah, well, I think my favorite one is hopefully obvious because it's Audius, but I think I would, I don't think there's kind of a universally agreed upon definition here just yet. I think our definition that we follow is a tool or set of tools for artists to use to engage their fans that allow them to have sovereignty over that audience. So that can mean a number of things, but primarily that the artist is able to kind of exfiltrate their data if they choose to, and use that in different experiences, different products, different contexts. There's no kind of platform lock-in in the way that you would traditionally think of in a kind of Web2 context, where the platform is controlling access to those relationships and things like that. So yeah, I know that that's a very broad definition, and it's one that we feel Audius kind of squarely falls into. But it's been really cool to see quite a few others over the last few years build with that same ethos and mentality as well. There's a lot of space here and a lot of greenfield for folks to build cool stuff.
Cool. Yeah, and outside of StreamCon, obviously we were talking earlier about the interesting stuff that you're working with. Like, what other areas are you seeing with regards to this broad subject of Web3 that people like experiences that people are building?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We get a lot of inbound leads from companies that are trying to do something interesting in the Web3 space, and they're really broad. Some are fan-based and trying to connect music assets with a fan-based experience and actually bring better value to the fans that ultimately might be via some NFTs or other tokens that are part of that. Other ones that we're seeing more now is Metaverse experiences. So they're companies that, or when I say companies, often individuals or companies that are trying to create some unique space in the Metaverse. And music doesn't really change if you're physical or in the Metaverse. It's still going to be the major way that you attract people to what you're trying to do and keep them engaged. So how do they actually have music in that space? And often, the more difficult question is how do they have commercial music in that space, right? Which we can touch on a little bit later in those areas. I'd say the other one is a little bit of my pet thing about interoperability. So we're seeing clients that are trying to do something in the Metaverse, but how do they take that music experience to a Web2 experience so that people can actually take it with them throughout the day? So, and I think that's a really interesting one for accessing non-natives.
Awesome. And Sophie, from your perspective as well, I guess you get to see a lot of things that people are building. Like, what are the things that really interest you?
Yeah, I mean, I was trying also going back to your first question, to try and find what are the common denominator between all the Web3 services, and also try to make the distinction between Web3 and Metaverse to the extent that there is a distinction that is firmly exists. I don't know if there is a firm definition of each, but I think one thing that hasn't been pronounced yet is decentralized. And I don't know, you are the technical expert, I think, more than me, but I would say that one of the first thing that comes to mind if I'm asked to describe Web3 would be decentralized and giving back more control to users of the service. And then of course you have Metaverse, which is more, to me at least, the way, I guess, when I try to think of the two, Metaverse is your video game-like experience, virtual world, and how do you engage with the virtual world, whereas Web3 is more almost of a political concept, which is more this new way of thinking the dynamic between the service and the user, or maybe the people using the service on the supply end and the people that are consuming the service. I don't know if that would be
no, absolutely. I think
from your perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I think there is a lot of crossover, I think. And I think that sort of, they're both very nebulous terms, right? It depends who you ask. Like, Mark Zuckerberg has a very different opinion of what the Metaverse is compared to, I guess, what I do. But yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. I think in terms of, and you've led quite nicely into the next question, which was in terms of sort of building experience in Web3 versus building Web2, what are the advantages? Like, why should people be looking towards building a Web3 experience, a Web3 service, from both a sort of platform perspective, also as a fan and a artist perspective? I think the first one is something that people don't really talk about that much, i.e. from a developer's perspective, why would you build a Web3 platform? Roneil?
Yeah, so I think actually I answer this question a lot, and I like to start with sharing the disadvantages, right? Or maybe why you shouldn't do this. It's harder, it takes longer, it takes more engineering effort, it takes more capital, it takes more energy to get these products to market. The onboarding burden for users is much higher. You go on and on and on, but there are a lot of good reasons not to build here. there's one really good reason to build here. And I think for certain use cases, the value that value prop, if you will, can bring to the use case can potentially overshadow all of those very negative things I just mentioned, right? And that one big value is to what Sophie said, decentralization. So in our case, the downstream effects of that are, and kind of, I guess, how I would define a Web3 music product experience being different from a Web2 one is allowing your users to kind of carry their data away with them, not having this kind of platform lock-in where they're kind of ball and chain anchored to continuing to use a given platform because they have no other way to kind of shift without having to rebuild from scratch. But really the only way to build confidence in that capability is by being decentralized, right? In the case of Audius, for example, our users actually have to vote on any and all changes made to the network. So it's not possible for me or my co-founder Forrest, who's in the audience today as well, to say, oh, we're gonna change Audius so you can't take your data out anymore. We would actually have to run that through a community governance process. So, I think where typically the value that decentralization can provide is in establishing trust where there is a lack of one today, because you don't have to trust a company to behave in a given way, because when that product is owned, operated, controlled by a dispersed community of stakeholders, there's an open democratic process for deciding how and when to make changes. So yeah, I think there's actually really quite a limited number of use cases where that I think that is important, and I'd honestly say for the majority of folks wanting to build projects or build ideas in music, you're kind of like shooting yourself in the foot many times over by trying to build in a decentralized fashion if you don't actually need to.
Yeah, and I think, Sophie, from a legal perspective, how do you see the two areas differ, or actually from your perspective, are they very similar? Like if somebody's trying to build a Web3 music service, is that a very similar conversation to somebody who's trying to build a Web2 music service?
For certain things, yes. I mean, the typical lawyer's response, yes and no, but I'll try to elaborate a bit on that. So you have fundamentals that are not going to change. So the law hasn't changed because Web3 was invented. Mm-hmm. So you have, for example, the copyright laws of the world have not changed since Web3 was invented. So you still would look at a Web3 music service in the same way as you would as a Web2. Mm-hmm. And you would look at, what's happening, where is the music hosted? Is an act of copying taking place? Is an act of communication taking place? Who is responsible for that act? And then therefore you would look at, who is responsible for clearing or licensing, etc. So of course, it may be a little bit different in a Web3 service from a Web2 service, because if you're hosting decentrally, there are different questions arising from a copyright perspective than if you're hosting centrally, where it's easier to know who is liable, responsible. But the underlying thinking will remain exactly the same, the way you analyze what's happening. Then you have other considerations in Web3, which is all to do more around tokens, and generally in Web3, you very quickly have a conversation about NFTs and tokens and what do you buy. And if you have to go and have that conversation, you have a new legal issues which were not typical in a Web2 scenario that are coming to the fore, which are your traditional question about what is an NFT, what exactly is it from an ownership perspective? Can you really own an NFT? Is it the same thing as owning a CD in the era of plastic? Then you have all of these new type of music services also about NFTs that could potentially distribute money to their holders. Is that, the good old debate that is always going to be on the table, whether there's a financial regulation element to what you're doing or not. So is it a security, is not a security? So you have new the legal topics are not new because they were already existing and other industries are very familiar with them. But of course, they may be new to people working in the music industry in that respect.
Yeah, and I think go on.
I was going to say that we see a lot of our clients are in emerging markets, so Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, some areas in South America, and often those markets are coming to us with wanting to put more dollars in the local artist's pocket. So create an actual system and infrastructure that will enable those artists rather than all that money going offshore. And I think Web3 is really interesting for them to be able to do that and give more autonomy to the artist. We're starting to enter testing in that space to the extent that we're enabling with a few of our clients over the next month or so that artists can actually mint NFTs in those countries. Those NFTs can actually come into a Web2 platform and be consumed alongside normal audio product. And then the revenue will flow back through the smart contract back to the rights holders in that space. So I think there is a bridging of things at the moment because, you know, if you look at most metaverses, I don't think you're going to find them sparsely populated at the moment, and people going there for very specific events. So the challenge is to make those much more engaging, and I guess so many more of them as well.
Fascinating. I think again, you guys are great. You just led me straight into the next question. On the topic of bridging, we're speaking at the moment of as Web3 has been a specific thing, which I think I would probably argue it would be, but like from a Web2 and Web3 perspective, you know, where can people who are looking to build in Web3 look to integrate with, i.e. the supply chains that exist within Web3 or the licensing structures, or even at the experience level, i.e. bring in things like Spotify, for example, like, you know, where are the opportunities do you see around bridging the gap? Some people call it Web 2.5, like this kind of idea of bridging between these two discrete areas.
I mean, from my side, I think there's still a lot of unknowns in that space. Licensing is difficult at scale to get master rights holders and publishers within an area that works commercially in that space. So I think that's challenging. I think there seems to be a real drive to get great outcomes there. So, but I think that'll change over time. But I think that's certainly a big challenge to those outcomes. Yeah, I think from that side. Sophie, what did you want to add?
I mean, Web 2.5 is interesting. I mean, what we see, and maybe it's a bit of a naive response, but a way to link a Web3 service and a Web 2 link, a good old hyperlink where you could, you know, like you could navigate from a Web3 to a Web 2, and maybe they can point to one another. And the beauty of an internet link is that not in every case you will have exceptions, but in a majority of the cases, you have less copyright issues to deal with when you link to content as opposed to copying it and taking a full copy and uploading it again. So that's one way that we see, an easy way that we see those two worlds interacting.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with what Con and Sophie said. I think there's such a vast amount of audience already aggregated on these platforms. It would be foolish for folks building in kind of this Web3 context to ignore that, right? And to the extent the tools that we are all building can be leveraged by artists, artist teams, labels, publishers, other industry stakeholders to increase the value of the content catalog that they own and the rights that they hold. That should be explored to its fullest. Now, whether or not existing Web 2 platforms would want to open that data up is I think a different question, and that's kind of where the rub here lies, which is I think the ethos of kind of open, permissionless, liquid access to data and other things runs quite counter to the kind of philosophy that most legacy platforms follow, which is to try to lock people in as much as possible, right? Over the last 4 or 5 years, it's no secret, right, that all the major DSP APIs have become more and more limited in what they allow people to do. And certainly the data that they make available has become more limited as well, even as they've built better BI tools for understanding it. So, I think those kind of legacy platforms who are more willing to open up their platforms to developers and to other folks to build around, which includes kind of Web3 native developers, those folks will end up having a leg up long term over the ones that refuse to do so. But I think, yeah, this will happen with or without, I think, the kind of support of the legacy platforms, but it could happen a lot faster and with more active participation from the legacy platforms if they're constructive in the process.
Awesome. Yeah. I think as you were saying that, I completely agree. I feel like, you know, I was at NFT NYC last week, and it was just so amazing to see so many musicians who've been brought up within this industry, Web3 music industry, like purely. But it very much feels like a local scene, you know, like going back home and seeing like all of your friends and etc. And it feels to me like scale is one of the things that we still need to crack. And so, you know, how will that happen, I guess? Part of that, I guess, is licensing, something that we should probably talk about based on the topic of conversation. But I've got one specific question around this. So one of the most interesting things over the past year has been the sort of prevalence of artists choosing Creative Commons licensing as a way to issue out their NFTs. How do you guys feel about that? And Sophie, specifically, like, do you see any challenges with that or opportunities?
So first, we look at a lot of NFTs, whether from clients or just when we do our own legal research, because it's still a very new product, and it's super interesting to see the different approaches from different lawyers, from different services, from different countries, and how, you know, what are the set of T's and C's that are attached to NFTs, because yes, you have T's and C's attached to NFTs, and I invite you to go and read them because they are very instructive, and also because at the moment there is no one type of NFT. An NFT can be anything you like. It can have 0 rights, you can have a ton of rights, you can have many different shapes and forms. So there's not one type of NFT, although we see that there is a type that is more frequent than another, and that's your just this kind of NFT as a connection between a buyer and the token. And that is basically the only thing that the NFT will do. It doesn't give you any rights. It doesn't give you any, no Creative Commons, nothing, not the right to make a copy of it, not the right to have the artwork of as your screensaver, nothing. It just gives you this connection and this, you know, trace and transaction in the blockchain that you have bought this unique connection with this piece of art or this piece of music. That's the most common one that we come across, but by far, but you know, by no means is it the only one. So I actually haven't come across that many NFTs that are Creative Commons, but I think definitely that's it's a very easy one to do because the agreement exists. You can just go get it, and for an artist, it's probably much more. It's quicker than go speak to a lawyer or trying to make up your own agreement. So I'm not surprised that this would be a very popular and practical solution. But again, it's really interesting to see how the different NFTs are so diverse at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that just speaks to the sort of how early we are. Everyone always says that, right? But we are, and like how experimental things are. Like there's no form that's taken yet. I guess, Roneil, like, do you think about this? How do you think about this from an audience perspective? Like, And again, specifically with the Creative Commons, are you starting to see artists come through who are specifying that this is Creative Commons, this music is being licensed according to Creative Commons? Or?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this. I can't recall a case. There is a field in Audius where when someone uploads their content, they're able to mark it as such. I know some folks who've uploaded content to Audius after issuing NFTs around it have marked it in that manner. Broadly to the question, I mean, I think it's really cool, like you said, to see artists experimenting with these things. The one concern I have around Creative Commons specifically is that the artist may be devaluing their future ability to monetize that content by doing so, and that's concerning, right? Imagine one of those tracks like ends up doing really well and breaking out, and then like movies and who knows what else start to use it royalty free because it's Creative Commons. I think one argument would be that the content having more reach ultimately brings more value back to the artist than if they were trying to kind of control how it was used. But on the other hand, I think an artist doing that as an experiment is completely closing the door to any future ability to change that choice, at least as I understand it. Maybe you can correct me more, but I don't think you can revoke if someone has already used content under Creative Commons license, you can't like revoke it afterwards. So yeah, I think it is really interesting to see. More generally, I think folks having a more clear understanding of what these rights means and what the choices are between different licensing structures and whatnot. That is a net good thing for everyone. And having more transparency, accountability around what rights artists are and are not giving up as they make various decisions in their career. I think that's also a very much a good thing. So to the extent that experimentation helps the world and the music industry understand more about the implications of these choices, that's very good for all of us. I just don't know how good it is for these specific artists that are making that choice.
That makes sense. I think we've got about 15 minutes left, looking to Paul for guidance here. 20 minutes. Oh, got ages. Awesome. Got loads of questions left, so good stuff. Cool. So one thing we were talking about earlier was the topic of sustainability. And I think it's a really interesting thing that we should talk about a little bit. So obviously these new models are emerging around tokens, and again, very experimental. But there's always this feeling in the back of the mind, like how sustainable is this as a model for the artist, for the platform, for the fan, everything. So from your perspective, again, back to you, I guess, Roneil, because you're the closest to this from a sort of operating perspective, what excites you and what concerns you with regard to this topic of sustainability and, I guess, business model?
Yeah, I think what excites me most here is just the explosion of experimentation we've seen around different token issuing models, different token distribution models, different minting prices on NFTs, different approaches to the distribution and kind of rights associated with governance tokens and the tokens that actually power these platforms themselves. So we're seeing kind of like every possible permutation under the sun being tried before our eyes, and we can learn a lot and observe a lot as these experiments play out. So that's what excites me most, is that in 5 to 10 years, we'll likely see consolidation around a smaller number of these approaches that we see be durable, sustainable, long-term. It's very unclear right now, at least to me, what those approaches are. I think we as a crypto community, at least like on that side of my brain, we really haven't figured out what is a long-term sustainable way to model like the issuance of NFTs, or how to price them, or how to collect do the transfer royalties, or like all of these sorts of things. So my only concern through all that experimentation is that there are going to be winners and losers, and in some cases, I think folks are going to be penalized for like sticking their neck out a bit and trying something new. And you know, to the extent all of us can be understanding of and welcoming of those folks as they try again in the future, I think that's the key, right? That's one thing I've seen be very different in the music community versus the tech community, is that at least in my experience anecdotally, the tech community is much more tolerant of you know, folks making mistakes, learning from them and moving forward, whereas the music community is, at least from what I've seen, much less so. So that would be my hope, is that people are you know, able to, you know, we as a community are able to work through this period of experimentation and get to the place that you know, where these models sort of work.
Yeah, and I think to provide some confidence there, having already been at a failed startup in the past in this space and then back again, there are opportunities. Cool. Con, from your perspective, like, you're trying to build a business around this emerging space. Like, what are the things that you're thinking about with regards to sort of business model, and like how you sustainably sort of experiment providing things in this space?
Yeah, I mean, internally, we certainly look at creating specific teams that are focused in this space so they can just experiment in that space. What works, what doesn't. Even from a team perspective, helping, I guess, a number of people in the team become much more comfortable in the environment so they can input into the process as well. Because I think there's still a fair bit of, I won't call it fear, although maybe that's part of it. It's certainly the unknown, right, in that process. You know, the very first, when we were created as a business, we came out of robotic CD duplication into the digital world, and the very first execution that we did in this space was a service that was in partnership with EMI before they were UMG, and it was a major telco in the Australian market. And users got $50 worth of downloads and unlimited streaming every month. That's what the users got. And everyone so valued the $50 of downloads and didn't care about the streaming, right? And you look at that today and you go, why would you bother? You've got everything for nothing. Why are you going to limit yourself to $50? But that market started to really evolve and change. And I think it's being connected to the people who are trying to create a difference in this space, which is, I think, the audience here, and understanding how we can support that through different mechanisms. Now, a great example is, you know, we're seeing a lot of growth in the traditional fitness and wellness space and mindfulness space. How does that space transition into Web3? What are the user experiences that will happen, most likely Metaverse experiences in that space, and how is music part of those solutions, right? We're starting to work with a few clients that are around dementia or other sort of, I guess, similar types of illnesses. How do they interact as we start to move into these spaces? And that's very much what we're looking at in terms of not just thinking of this is another way that people are going to interact. And I think we'll sit here in 3 or 4 years' time, and I think 90% of what we discussed here was rubbish, right? Because it never worked out that way. But 10% plus whatever the journey was is going to really start to change it. And I think you've got to be in the game to understand it. You sort of can't come in later and hope to sort of get it as it's going along.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing is we are discussing it, right?
Yeah.
Cool. And yeah, so in terms of those different, you're talking about things like meditation apps and stuff. Like, what are the things that are really exciting you in that area?
Oh, there's definitely a lot. I would say generally in the gaming area, and I think that's an area that traditionally hasn't been thought about as a metaverse, except obviously there's a few, players that you think about in that way. But more and more it's becoming those sort of metaverse and shared experiences. So then how do you actually provide a technology set that enables people to go through those worlds or those game experiences with either shared music or individual music experiences? How do you actually provide music suggestions and AI to either real or virtual characters in those games, and actually start to actually provide music that are starting to be consumed by those characters, which are NFTs in those games as well? So I think that area is absolutely, you know, just going to continue in gaming to sort of start to take it into that world.
Awesome. So I think slightly different track. One of the very interesting things about tokens is that they start to blur the line between a fan and an investor, which, you know, occurs within an NFT perspective, but also from a, you know, topic of this conversation, a Web3 music services platform perspective. Why is that exciting and why is that scary? Sophie.
It's scary for people that are building that profile of fan investor, because they have to swallow or get their head around a gigantic amount of pre-existing regulation, which has been created for a Web2 environment, or maybe even Web 1, or even so yeah, it requires a willingness to learn new things. And even I think for me and my partner Nick, that I can see in the room, we've learned more about FinReg in the last 2 years than ever before in our lifetime, because as media and entertainment lawyers, we never really had to worry that much. I mean, of course, we have people in our team who are doing only financial stuff in the media industry, but that was not us. And so it's been a learning curve, and we can see how much our clients have to get their head around. I mean, I don't know if there's definitely a speculative angle at the moment around NFTs and tokens. We all know that. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but the way I see it, what excites me is really more the part of Web3, which is this infrastructure that is going to be almost the foundation to build so much more on top of it. It's that one little brick that you put in the sand, and then you will build all this utility. So the utility component of tokens looks super exciting from where we sit as technology and media lawyers. And if you're talking about being an investor in the sense that you own or you are able to make decisions about the platform through these governance tokens, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be looking at that in a speculative way. It just means more you're participating, and I think that's super exciting. The other aspect, which is more, again, the very financial hardcore stuff, is it's a lot to deal with.
Yeah, I feel that. I think being at a startup that was thinking through an ICO back in like 2018, Christ. Roneil, from your perspective, you have users within your platform. There's a token. They are part of the sort of tokenomics of that platform. What considerations are constantly running through your head around how to get good outcomes from that versus potential bad outcomes?
That's such a good question. So you know, we kind of, the vast majority of the decisions that were made around this structure were made before the launch of the network, right? Because post that moment, the community controlled any and all changes around that. And you know, the positive of that was that people could build around Audius, use Audius, build a fan base via Audius with confidence that those things wouldn't change on them. The flip side of that is that, you know, as we've all seen in government and governance structures around the world, democracies are a bit slower typically to do things than autocracies, dictatorships, et cetera. That's not to say that that is a better model. That's a worse model, I think, for a lot of reasons. But in that one aspect, they're able to be more agile and move more quickly. So, you know, I think we, with respect to how the Audius token is earned by and leveraged by users from the network, be those folks who are helping to host content or folks who are sharing content, folks who are helping to curate content. All of those kind of behaviors can be done to earn some control of the network in the form of the token. I think we tried to, with that initial structure, be quite simple and really limited, honestly, in how we rolled it out, such that the community could iterate from there towards whatever model made sense. I think without that, data learning understanding, we're, anyone who's like trying to model these things or sort of invent some structure and then have a high degree of confidence in whether it will or will not work. I don't think that's really possible, right? You just sort of have to start simple and at least like limit the amount of damage bad decisions could make, and then create structures that allow folks to repair those bad decisions and iterate forward from them. So I think that is my biggest concern, though, I guess, is what I've seen happen across the crypto community the last 2 to 3 years is an unwillingness to change, right? People see these initial, arguably random decisions that were made just because some parameter had to be chosen as like a gospel truth that has to be followed. I think in Bitcoin, we've seen this to the worst extent, just because the person who made those decisions in most cases is no longer like present in the community, that Satoshi Nakamoto, right? But Ethereum, I think, has had similar problems just because Vitalik is often unwilling to weigh in on these issues. And I think he's right to not weigh in, but it does create this sort of, people trying to guess at like why certain things work a certain way. And I think oftentimes the actual answer is, well, it had to work some way in V1. So like some, engineer somewhere along the way who was building it just arbitrarily decided it would work this way. And now that kind of baggage follows us. So long story short, I think, communities need to be more comfortable with, I think, the level of control that they are being given by these platforms. It's a new role for users of a network to play, right? Just as you said, this is not for users of networks to also be kind of principles of the network in a certain capacity. That's not a role that people are used to playing. So I think we're all learning what makes sense there. There are some models I've seen go really well that I'm excited to see folks continue to iterate on. But yeah, I just hope we can all be willing to make change over time.
Absolutely. That was a really full and great answer. We've only got 5 minutes left, so if you
I
want
was
to say
just
something.
going to ask, how do you educate your users? Because it sounds like that's what we need to do: educate these communities.
Yeah, I think that is, I'll keep the answer very brief. I think that is the hardest aspect of this, because to be honest, I don't think we know what to educate them with, right? But I think, what we've tried and seen success with it, at least within our community, is folks kind of, kind of in a more homegrown and organic fashion, creating their own content to walk other users in the community through how to use things, why to use them in a certain way, things of that nature. I actually think that's a lot more effective than the folks who made some of those design decisions in some cases very early on, imposing their kind of their predisposed or pre-held beliefs on the community. But it's an ongoing challenge. I think there are 7-8 million people in the Audius network today. Realistically, most of those people probably don't know how like a lot of this works, nor should they, right? But I think as a user becomes one of those more kind of influential users in terms of their control of the network, et cetera, there should be kind of a gradual on-ramp to them being able to learn.
Great. I think we probably have time for one question or so. So Paul, although we can count that as the first question. So again, another great segue.
My name is Chris. I run a small distribution and artist services company called Wings. And one of the things I'm picking up from today is that the opportunities for artists in Web3 might be more obvious if you've got an established fan base, and if you're taking an audience in, finding new ways to engage that audience. The vast majority of our artists are on the kind of developing, emerging space, and they're currently very heavily reliant on Web2 music service platforms for audience growth and their music being discovered. I'm wondering what the panel would advise one of my artists in terms of how best to approach Web3. What are the opportunities for artists who are in the developing and emerging space?
I think I can probably take that one, if that's okay. Having been around a community of very early stage artists last week who are very engaged in the Web3 community, I'd probably argue it's easier to do so as a developing artist, because you don't have the same baggage of like representatives. So I think, like, from your perspective as a label, there's an opportunity for you to give them freedom to be able to experiment in this new world, and, you know, support them on the stuff that you can do really well. I think from their perspective, it's all about going feet first into the community, getting involved in Twitter, Discord, and, you know, getting to understand who are the people who say it's like a small local scene. Like, you got to know who the promoters are, who the other bands are, that kind of thing. So that would be my advice.
One more question?
Yep. Hi, I'm Omar Ismail. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a platform called Temple. Question for Roneil, if that's okay. You mentioned that on one side you have these Web3 companies who are based on permissionless, interoperable, kind of data sharing philosophy. And then on the other, you have the, I suppose, data protectionist Web2 platforms. Do you think there'll be kind of an inflection point or a point in time when these Web2 companies will have to start shifting into like an active Web3 philosophy? Or do you think it's going to be more of a kind of innovator's dilemma situation where they're just eventually superseded by Web3 companies because of their inability to innovate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually don't think it will be either. I think both models will be able to coexist long term. I think they tend to serve different use cases. Kind of back to what Dan said earlier about these like the kind of Web3 native, Web3 only artists that are up and coming. You know, and this is a gross generalization. It doesn't apply everywhere, but I think broadly what we've seen is on these kind of Web3 native music networks, the average fan is monetizing at a far higher level, but they are a small segment of the typical fan base, right? Which is super different from kind of the mass scale, mass audience approach that Web2 platforms typically take. Now, whether or not the existing Web2 platforms kind of advantage in the market is exclusively derived or even partially derived from their level of control of data and user experience, I actually don't know. But I think they will continue to have an important place in this world. I'll be honest, I'm curious if anyone on this panel disagrees, right? Like, I still think if you're trying to build a user base at scale, that is the best place to do it. If you're trying to make as much money as possible and have as much control of your fan base as possible, I think crypto is a great place to do that. Those are different goals, right? If you want to be Drake, like selling out Wembley or whatever, I don't think in today's Web3 ecosystem there's a path to you being able to do that in a fully Web3 native fashion. But again, yeah, I don't know how much that advantage is being, or you know, the ability to build to that level of scale comes from their control of data.
I agree.
We've got sorry, it's quite a fun question. Sorry, Sophie, I apologize in advance, but from Josh. Does the notion of land ownership in the metaverse affect the territorial remit of PROs when attempting to collect for public performance on virtual land? Nice question.
Don't we have a panel about licensing the metaverse coming up?
Well, we have a presentation, yeah, but you have the answer now.
Right, where to start? It's a really good question. Yeah, territorial. Copyright is territorial. For those of you who deal with copyright, you probably know that. So you have a law that has been made at the scale of one country. And then you have the internet, which of course is global. So it's not new that we've had us lawyers, but also anyone working in that industry. Often you come up against the limitations of having a local copyright dealing with a global internet. And that's how us lawyers are trying to be helpful. But it's definitely not perfect. And the fact that it is in a metaverse doesn't really, I don't think it changes really the problem that already exists in a Web2, where a website that is available globally on the internet will still have to deal with local laws. Whether it's a full metaverse experience or just a Web2 doesn't change the fundamental problem. Yeah, I'll stop there, I think.
What if it was in space?
What if it's if it is in space? I don't think there's copyright law in space, so you're good.
Cool.
I think we better leave it there before it gets too meta. Thanks very much, Dan, and all the panelists. Thank you very, very much. And I should add a special thanks as well to Sophie and ReedSmith, who will be hosting our next big event in January, Nylon Connect, just around the corner in their beautiful offices. And also to Roneil and Shamal there at the back, just to say thank you to you from Pandora, Audius and Pandora, who sponsor the provision of our business information service to artist managers, so they get it free of charge. So just to say thank you for your continued support. Thanks, everybody.